Welcome to another video tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a look at using JSON files in your game projects. So JSON files are essentially an external file. They are not created or edited inside RPG in a Box. You would use a text editor to create these files. And these files essentially just store your game's data inside. So things like quest IDs, item IDs, properties, stats, all of those sort of things. And your game can then read this data back in and use it inside your game. So there's a couple of benefits to using a JSON file for your game projects. The first is that you can have a set of JSON files which store how your entities and items and things should start at the beginning of your game. And then when you start your game, you can grab the data from the JSON files and distribute that data among your entities and your items and things. So you can give yourself all the items you should start with, give your entities all the properties they should start with, give yourself all the global properties that you should have, give yourself all the give your entities all the stats and yourself all the stats, etc. So you can basically use it to set your game up with all the sort of numerical and text data that it should have at the start of the game. So rather than putting all of that into your startup script instead can just grab the data from the JSON files. Another advantage to using a JSON file is that you can store all of your data, your codexes and things, inside a JSON file, which means they're then not taking up any sort of space inside your code. So rather than having your codexes inside the code of your game, you can put them off to one side in a JSON file, and then whenever you need to use that data, you can just momentarily retrieve it from the file, and then that file is then closed once you've retrieved the data. So it just means that rather than having a global property, for example, that's a codex of, for example, all of your quest IDs, taking up, memory space in your game, instead you can put your codex of all your quest IDs in an external file that therefore is then not running in the background of your game the whole time, and you can just retrieve those quest IDs as and when you need them using the data request to grab the JSON file. So those are the benefits to using a JSON file. Now there's a couple of limitations you need to be aware of with JSON files. First of all, they are read-only, which means that while you can retrieve the data from a JSON file, so you can read the data into your game, and while your game can then make alterations to that data when it's inside the game, what it can't do is write the data back to that JSON file so it's then changed. So the benefit to that, though, is that, for example, when we use JSON files for starting up our game or resetting our game, we know and we can therefore trust that those values are going to be being put back to their correct initial values. And that's the reason why those sort of JSON files are read-only. So, as I say, we can read the data in, but we can't write the data back, okay? However, it is possible to save your own JSON files while in the game, and I'll show that briefly at the end. So there's two different types of JSON files. In other words, they're saved to two completely different locations and serve different purposes. So I'll go over that at the end. The other limitation to be aware of with JSON files is because they are not exclusive to RPG in a Box, JSON files are used in many different game design software, but also web design servers, that sort of thing. It means that there's going to be some data types that are RPG in a Box specific, such as coordinate, tile, cardinal directions like south, west, east, navigation types like walk and interact only. There might be some others I'm not thinking of at the moment. Color might be another one. And they're not going to be supported by a JSON file. So if you put those into a JSON file as they are, then when you try and read the JSON file, you'll get errors saying that it's not a valid JSON file. So the types of data that JSON files support are strings, numbers, booleans, and JSON files are essentially arrays and codexes. So if you're already very familiar with using those in RPG in a Box, then once we get to actually creating one, which we'll get to in a second, you'll hopefully see the similarities and therefore be almost ready to go the moment you see how this sort of all comes together. If you've not used arrays or codexes before, then I recommend starting with those first. So get to grips with using just the internal arrays and codexes inside RPG in a Box before you start looking externally to putting all that data inside a JSON file. So when it comes to putting RPG in a Box specific data like coordinate, tile, that sort of stuff into RPG in a Box, into a JSON file, sorry, you do need to sort of store it as one of the 4 types that a JSON file supports, whether that be a string, number, boolean, that sort of thing. So it's worth mentioning that coordinate and tiles are just arrays. They're just arrays without the word tile and without the word coordinate. You'll see that I demonstrate that with one of my JSON files. The directions, south, east, and west, can be, instead of just being capital letters, they can be stored inside a JSON file as a lowercase string. And when it comes to the navigation types, walk and interact, you can actually store those as integers, as numbers. So walk and interact can be stored as 0, walk only can be stored as 1, interact only can be stored as 2, and I believe pending will be stored as 3. Now, currently, as of filming this video, there's going to be a patch that will allow you to then use the numbers in your modify navigation and replace navigation functions. Currently, they don't support it, but that will be fixed in the next patch. So with that all said, let's now get into how and where do you create these JSON files. Let's choose a folder in the Game Explorer, let's say tiles, and I'm going to right click and do Open Folder Location, and you should see a browser pop up. And this is a very quick way to get to your project folder. Now, obviously at the moment when this opens, you're going to be inside the specific folder you right clicked on, in this case tiles. So what you want to do then is go up one folder so that you're in your main project folder. So this project of mine is called the lift. So I'm now in the lift folder. You should know you're in the right folder because you should see folders for things like characters, dialogues, maps, objects, scripts, tiles, that sort of thing. If you can see all of those folders, then you're in the right place. Oh, I should point out as well, you'll see there's a few JSON files already in your project folder. Those are the ones that are made by your project. So you will never really touch those. You should have no reason to touch the main engine JSON files, but I'm just highlighting that they're there. If you want to, edit them for whatever reason, maybe something goes wrong with one of your items, you can potentially go into the JSON file and there might be a reason, something's misspelled or something, you might be able to fix it from there. So it's just good to mention that they're there if you ever need to use them. But you shouldn't really ever need to touch them. But what we're going to do now, we're in the main folder, we're going to right click and create a new folder. And we're going to call this lowercase data, okay? And press OK. And inside the data folder, that's where all your custom JSON files are going to go. So I can right click and I can create a new text file and I can call this anything. So let's say I call this items.json. Now, you'll want to make sure that your operating system, assuming maybe it's Windows or it could be Linux, whichever you're using, but make sure that you have the ability to show file extensions so that you can see the very last part of a file name when you make it. Because if you can't, and you just assume you're calling something items.json, then it might be that you've actually called it that. So it's still a .txt file, It just happens to be called items.json.txt. You don't want that. You want it to actually be a file called items that is of the type JSON. So you need to make sure that you can see the very, very last bit of your file name so that you can delete that. So you change the file to a JSON file and say, OK. And then that will create a JSON file. If it's a .txt file, it won't work inside RPG in a box. Okay. So with that created, we can then open this with any text editor. But obviously I recommend things like Notepad++ or TextPad, where you can lay things out in a sort of structured, tabbed way, so you can easily see which bit relates to which, because if you use something like Notepad, it can be a bit archaic. But that's not to say you can't just use any simple text editor, because in essence, that's all it is. It's just a text file. So we're now ready to start talking about how to lay out a JSON file. So JSON files are typically either an array or a codex, okay? And you'll put your data that you want to have inside this JSON either within an array or within a codex. The answer to should it be an array or should it be a codex all comes down to what do you want to store in this JSON file and how do you want to manage, how do you want to be able to handle that data inside RPG in a box. So for example, if I'm just going to make a JSON file which just has a collection of all the item IDs, then that can just be an array, because in essence all I would then do is write out in a string all my item IDs for my game, one after the other, like so, just going down the array like that. Imagine these are all different. And so my point earlier is, can you imagine building this array in your game? Now you can sort of have all of your items separate from the code of your game and just have it in a file that's off to one side, that's not actually open and therefore running while your game's running. And then whenever you want to retrieve one of these items or a couple of these items, your game can just open this file when it wants to grab a piece of information, grab that piece of information, and then close the file. So it's only for a fraction of a second that this data is even being used by your game, as opposed to if it was in a global property codex or a global property array, it would be built at the start of your game and would be constantly in the background of your game all the time. So JSON files, again, are a great way of putting all of that sort of informational load, taking it away from your game. So now we've got a array filled with item IDs. Obviously, in this case, they're duplicated. But, if you imagine this was 1 to 27 or something, then we could now use this in our game. Now, another thing to mention about the way JSON files are structured is you'll see these commas at the end of every item ID, okay? Those denote that the data that you're entering is not finished yet. There's still another piece of data to come, okay? So this comma here is erroneous, it's wrong, because the JSON file is then going to complain that it's not finished. It's expecting a piece of data that is never going to come, because this was actually the last piece of data I wanted to put into the file. So all you do is just make sure that the last piece of data doesn't have a comma, okay? And that also applies to any arrays that you have in your JSON file. So for example, I could put a comma here and I could have another one, or I could have a codex or something underneath, right? Again, if this is the last codex, then I should make sure that I don't have a comma there. So because this is the only array I want in this file, I should make sure there's not a comma there. If there's a comma at the very last, if the very last symbol of a JSON file is a comma, it will error, because it assumes that the file is not complete, it hasn't been finished. It's still waiting for something. So make sure that the last symbol of your JSON file is usually the opposite to the symbol that you started it. So if you started with an open square bracket, the last symbol should be a closed square bracket. If you opened it with curly braces, then the last one should be a closed curly braces. Yeah. It's also possible to lay things out in a single line. So for example, this would work. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but you get the idea. You could have these just in one long line going from left to right, or you can have them separated by the commas, like so, okay? Just make sure that if you are going to do new lines, you do the new lines after a comma, so don't do that, okay? I mean, it actually doesn't matter thinking about it because it should still function just the same, but generally it's just a good idea to make it easier for you to read and follow what how your JSON file's laid out. If you have the commas at the end, then you can always see where one might be missing or where one might be needed to be removed, okay? It's possible as well to put codexes inside a JSON file, inside an array. So here we have an array, for example, but the array could contain a codex, or the array could also contain another array, okay? So it's possible to put layers of, you can have layers within layers of arrays and codexes, okay? And I'll show a couple of examples of where that's being done. So with that said, I think we can now quickly move on to the next topic, which is using these JSON files. A couple of examples of using JSON files in your projects and how to read them back into your game. So I'm actually going to not use any custom ones I'm going to make in the video because I've actually pre-made some that I'm going to quickly explain in the video. So I'll just grab those, go back to my data folder and paste. And let's start with startItems.json. Okay, if I open this with Notepad++ or QQ, and we'll ignore that. So this is an array, starts with an array, and inside the array are 3 separate codexes. And inside each codex are 2 values, the ID and the count. And what this JSON file is designed to do is it's designed to give these items and the amount of items to the player at the start of the game. So at the start of the game, I'm going to get 1 of this item, 3 of this item, and 8 of this item, okay? So let's go to our project and set that up to work. So to reference a specific item, let's say, for example, we just wanted to give the player, we just wanted to reference, for example, the count of this entry. So we don't want to sort of grab everything. We just want to look up one particular piece of information inside a JSON file. I'll explain that first. So to do that, let's say we want, banana count. So we have a record of how many bananas how many bananas are there in the JSON file. We can do equals, and then to read a data file, instead of doing array like you would do with an array, or codex like you would do with a codex, what you're actually going to do is type data, open and close square brackets. So it's actually very similar, okay? But data tells RPG in a box that you're actually going to use an external file. This information is actually going to come from an external file rather than set up an internal codex or an array. This is going to look externally for a piece of information. And then what you do is inside the square brackets in a string, you pass in the full name of the JSON file upon which the data is going to come from. So in this case, startItems.json, okay? Now, inside the JSON file is an array. This first part of the JSON file is an array. So what we then want to do is grab the relevant index in the array. So this would be index 0, this would be index 1, this would be index 2. I want to look up the bananas, which is item 7. I'll just show you that. So you can see my bananas here are item 7. Okay, so going back to the script, I want to pass in the index number 2. So that will grab 0, 1, 2. That will now be in the correct codex for these particular values. And then the last thing I want to do is look up the relevant piece of data within that codex, in this case, count. Okay, if I now print $banana count, that will return 8. That will return this number here. Okay, to save time, I'm not going to run the game to show that. You can verify that if you want to in your own time. But that is in essence how you read data, single data, back out from a JSON file. Okay, so we're basically, the layering is the file and then the first array and then the codex in the file. So because this JSON file has sort of 3 layers to it, it's got the array, it's got the codex, and then the data inside. That's why we're sort of referencing it 3 layers deep. Yeah. But let's say we actually want to give the player all of the items and their respective counts. So how would we do that? So we can use a for loop for that. We can say for $items in data start items.json. And because we are grabbing everything, we don't need to refine the data file any further than that. We don't need to get the index number. We don't need to get the codex key, because we're just going to grab all of that stuff. So we're just going to loop through the whole of the data file. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say give item. And then we can reference data. No, we don't. We just reference $item, this thing we're iterating through, and then we grab the relevant piece of information in the codex. So ID will return the item ID that we're currently on as we loop through, and then $items count will return the amount. Yeah, so we're getting the ID first and then the count by just looping through and storing this file inside here. And then as it goes through, it gives those relevant things to the player. So if we just quickly test that, make sure that works, our inventory should now be full. Okay, 1 sword, 3 apples, and 8 bananas. Okay, let's take a look at another example. So this is quite a simple JSON file, but we could get it maybe a little bit more advanced. Let's close that and take a look at maps.json. So here we have one that again is a set of codexes inside an array, and each codex has 3 values inside, 3 pieces of data inside. It has the name of the map, the coordinate that you should start on. Again, notice how the coordinate is an array. It's not an actual coordinate. I've stored it without the word coordinate. And then facing is the direction the player should face when they load into that map. So again, I've made it the text version, the lowercase string version, as I mentioned earlier, so that these will work both as a JSON file, but also it will work when read back into the game. So let's take a look at using this JSON file and how we would use this bit of data, reading it back into the game. So let's go to our startup script again, and let's set up a system where every time you click new game, it randomly picks a map and uses that map's relevant coordinates and that map's relevant facing to give you a random start each time. So the first thing we want to do is generate a random number for the index. Okay, in fact, we'll call this map index. So this is going to be a random number between 0 and I think it's 3. So that's going to be either 0, 1, 2, or 3. And the reason for that is because, again, if we look at the JSON file, arrays always start at 0. So it's always going to be offset by the amount. So there's 4 entries, but it will go from 0 to 3. So I'm going to get a number that's either 0, 1, 2, or 3. So that will be valid for any one of the maps in that array. Next, what we want to do, just to make life easier for ourselves, is I'm going to do make a local variable called file, which I'm just going to store in here the maps.json. Okay, just so I don't have to keep typing data maps.json throughout this process. Then we want the map name, and for that we're going to reference the file, i.e. the maps.json. We are then going to reference within that file the relevant number we've just been generated by the randomizer, so that will be the index of the array. And then because this is the name, once you've got the right map in the index, we want specifically the data assigned to the word name. Okay, so again, looking at the codex, name will return the name of the map, and therefore this local variable will now be the name of the randomly picked map. Then we have $map coordinate, and that's just going to equal $file $map index, and then we want to look up the data with the name coord. So that will be the array coming into the map coordinate. And then the last thing, map facing, and that's going to equal $file the map index that's been rolled, and then look up facing and return that string into map facing. And then the last thing is just to put it all together. So load map, and we'll get rid of this because we don't want to load 2 maps. So load map, we want to use the map name as the map that it should load. And then we're going to use coordinate because we have to put that array back as a coordinate so that load map knows it's a coordinate rather than just some random numbers. So we're going to pass in our map coordinate, which now is an array, but we now need to restructure it back as a coordinate. So what we need to do is put the first number in the array as the x, comma, $map coordinate. The second number in that array should be the y, $map coordinate, and then the third number in that should then be the z. And then the last thing is map facing, and then that should be the text for whatever the facing is. And there we go. So now we've got a random map loader using all of the pieces of information from the data file. And what I did first of all is I put this text inside this variable first, so I don't have to keep typing data maps.json every single time I want to retrieve that piece of data. We'll use this idea again in a second when we do another example. So let's give this a test. We should now have a random map loader every time we click new game. So there's one map. There you go, I'm in a different map facing a different way. Let's do it one more time. And there we go, another map, another direction. So, does that make sense? So the last one I want to show before we sort of wrap this video up is, let's go over npcs2.json. So here I have a slightly more complicated JSON file in the sense that it's a main array as usual. You don't always have to start with an array, by the way. It's just that the examples I'm showing have always started with an array. So we've got a main array, and inside the main array are 2 codexes, but inside each codex are 2 other codexes, because in this case, I want to put in a JSON file all my NPCs. And alongside each NPC, I want to store each NPC's properties, its entity properties, but also its stats. So again, this could be used to start up my game. So I can put everything back to how it should be at the start of the game. So what entity properties should be set, and what stats should be set. Okay, so here I have an example where I've got, an entity called Bob, and this is his entity ID and the Goblin's entity ID, the relevant properties for that entity and the relevant stats for that entity. And then the idea is that at the start of the game, my code will grab this file, look up each NPC by its ID, and then give that entity these properties and these stats at the start of the game. So let me show an example of how to do that. So let's go back to our code and we'll click Edit. So the first thing I need to do is I need a incrementer that I can use to sort of iterate through the array index as we go through. So I'm just going to kick off a for loop through this entire JSON file. So we're going to go through the whole file. The first thing we want to do is grab the current entity ID that we're on. And what I might do as well is bring back this process so that I don't have to keep typing data NPCs JSON into all these for loop stuff. So entity ID equals the data file that we're currently on, but more importantly, the entity number that we're on, and then grab the ID. That will then put the current entity ID into that local variable. Once we know the ID that we're on, or once we know the current index we're on, we can then loop through that particular entity's properties. So we can say for $prop in, and then we'll loop through data NPCs JSON, but more specifically, the index that we're on, and even more specifically than that, the relevant codex props. So that would be this one here. So that's now going to loop through all of these. And as you loop through all of those, we want entity, pass in the ID so it knows which entity we're referring to, dot property, and then $prop. So the current property out of these that it's grabbed, the property name basically, that will be populated in there. And it's going to equal data JSON, the current number that we're on, the properties codex, but more specifically, look up the property name and get the value for that property. So that will put that will set the correct value to that property for that entity. And it's going to loop through for all of the properties for this entity, doing that in a loop. And then when it's done the properties, we want to repeat that once more for the stats. So for every stat in $file, $ent_num, but more specifically now loop through the stats codex, we want to repeat the following. We may as well just grab this because it's going to be mostly the same. Entity ent ID, except it's not going to be .property now. It's going to be .stat, and it's going to be $stat, and then we want to look up the stats codex, and then look up within the stats codex the stat name and get the value for that stat and put it into the entity ID's stat. And then the last thing we want to do at the end of all the inner for loops, but not at the end of the main, or not outside of the main one, we want to then increment the index, the array indexer, by 1. So it keeps going up. So the first time it will be all of Bob's properties and stats, and then it will add 1 and it will look up the Goblin's properties and stats. And if we had other NPCs in here, it would just keep going. So you could, have another one of these. If you had a third NPC, for example, I'm not going to actually do it, but if you had a different NPC with all the properties and stats, so it's entirely up to you how you do this. But again, make sure that the last one doesn't have a comma. Otherwise it will error. Okay, so save that, and this should be good to go. So if we apply and save that and load our game, we should see that our Goblin and Bob here, because that's the ID, if I select them, this NPC has the ID Bob, this NPC is Goblin. So these two NPCs should have their stats and properties assigned as soon as we start the game. Okay, we've got a slight issue there then. We'll take a look at that. So there's something wrong with the JSON file. If you get this error, it's good that this happened because I can at least mention it. If you get this a load of errors here, it means the JSON file is invalid. There's something wrong with it. And in fact, I think I know what it is. I can already see it's actually not a problem with the JSON file. I've mistyped the name of the JSON file in my script. So be very careful with that, as always. Let me just quickly fix that. So this should be npcs.json. So this whole file which I was referencing had the wrong name. But just to point out, if you do get that error, it could also mean that it's not a problem with your code. It could be that there's something wrong with the layout of your JSON file, whether it be a data type is not supported, like for example, you've put an RPG in a box, piece of code in there, or you haven't got a right comma, or you've got one where you shouldn't. So that error can also mean a problem with your JSON file as well. Try this again. So we don't get any errors, so that's a good sign. So let's just quickly check a couple of these. We won't do all of them. But if I print Bob's property, you should have one called money. Now I have not put this in his property, in his custom properties section. So he shouldn't have this any other way than the JSON file populating it. And he does. He's got 250 money. If we check his health, I set in the JSON file that he should have 40 HP. And he does. And if we just quickly hover over the Goblin, we'll just check the Goblin has an is alive Boolean, which should be true because he's alive. And the Goblin's health is 15. So let's check that. Yeah. So it's gone through and it's given all these entities their correct properties and stats. So I'm going to start wrapping this video up, but there are a couple of other things I want to quickly mention. So I'm going to try and quickly get through these. So first of all, be aware that with something like this, the limitations with entities still applies. Okay. Entities are not global. Okay. So this script will only really work for the starting map that has these entities in. So if I've got in my NPC's JSON file, any NPCs that aren't in the map that you load into at the start of the game, then it won't be able to set those stats and properties on those entities because it won't be able to find them. So you might want to, for example, put some of your NPCs into different JSON files that get triggered on a load map, for example. So when you do load a map for the first time that has a new set of entities in, they get set up the first time. You could do something like that. Or you could just stick with putting custom properties on the NPC directly. This is just an example of what you can do. You don't have to do it this way. So the other thing is to show you a really simple JSON file that you can make, which is just a codex. Because I've shown you currently loads of ones that start with an array and have codexes inside. But we could also make one, which I don't have, so I'll just quickly create one. Oops. We could also make one called globals.json. And if we just quickly open that, and this can be a codex. So this is curly braces. And all you do is you just put your global properties in here. So you start with the string, which is your property name. So I don't know, quest 1 done. And then a comma, not a comma, colon, and then this would be a Boolean, so false. That should be how that global property should start at the beginning of your game. You might have one for player money, and then that should be, I don't know, 150 maybe. You have currency or something. Obviously that would be a stat normally, but you know, just to give you an example. You might have player name, I don't know, all sorts of things you could do here. So point is, wouldn't be Bob, let's call him Barry. So what you can do is you can just basically lay out all of your global properties in this codex, like so. And then that sort of separates them from your game. You could still set them up in the game configuration UI, or you could still put them manually in the startup. But instead of having to declare them all manually in startup, you can just lay them all out here in a JSON file and then save it. That's all that's simply all. This is all you have to do for a global properties, is just have a single codex with all of the global property name and the global property value, one after another, separated by a comma, and make sure the last one doesn't have a comma. Now, obviously here we've got data repetition, so it's probably just going to overwrite them constantly. But if we were to use this in our script and we wanted to give ourselves all those global properties at the start of the game, we would just do for glob, let's say, in data globals .json, do end, and then you would do global .property. Glob would be the property name, equals, and then for now we'll just do it this way, data globals .json, and then you would look up glob. So that would basically be, for example, global property quest1 done equals true. Okay, so it's going to put the name of it in there and then look up the data for it and put it in the property. And it's just going to do that for all of the globals. So that's a quick example of a JSON file. It's extremely simple to make. It's just your properties. And then that's how you would just give all the global properties, set them all up at the start of the game. So let's just quickly just verify that has worked. I'll just print one of them, because if one has worked, then the others will have worked as well. So let's just print global.property player money is 150. So it exists and it's set. Okay. So the last thing to talk about is that I mentioned at the very beginning of the video that JSON files are read-only and you can't write to them. And that is true of the ones that are in the data folder of your project, okay? But it is possible to write an array or a codex into a JSON file. So let me show you how you do that. I'll just do it in startup very quickly. So let's say you've made a change to some piece of data. I don't know, you've got a string, let's say, called string1, and it equals, I don't know, some text. And you might have another variable, which is a number. And you might have, I don't know, anything, basically, anything you want. Let's have a Boolean as well. Okay, so here we've got some pieces of information that we want to store inside a JSON file. So JSON files, when you're writing to them, as long as they're an array or a codex, you can store them as a JSON file. So what we'll do is we will now make a codex of these pieces of data. So we'll just put value1, and then that can be $string1. Value 2, that can be var, and then value 3, and that can be $bool. So here's our codex, okay? And then if you want to make a JSON file, you just type save data, and then you pass in what's the data you want to save. So in this case, Cody, the codex. And then what's the file name? So if you want to save it as a codex, you just give your file a name, but add .json at the end, okay? So now, if we apply and save that, we've now got a piece of code that's going to take some data and store it in a JSON file. And your JSON files will be stored in the same place where your save games are located. So this is where JSON file, when I run the game, is going to be created. So let's run the game and see what happens. So that should have created in the background a JSON file. And there it is, myfile.json. If we open this up in text editor, we can see it's made a codex. If we lay this out like we were laying our JSON files out for a second, so if I put a new line there, and a new line there, and a new line there, and there, you can see that this is pretty much what we were doing ourselves, but we've been able to create this in our game. And then if you want to read that data back, you would use the load data function. So you would do, let's say you wanted to grab specifically the Boolean, then you could say Boolean value as a variable, for example, equals load data, myfile.json, and then because it's a codex inside, you would then pass in value 3. And then that would give you the Boolean value into this variable that's inside that JSON file. So that's how you can use ones that you can store and retrieve as well. But they're completely separate to the ones that we've been going over for the majority of this video. So with that all said, that's going to wrap this video up. Apologies, it's been a long one, and unfortunately it just is a long topic to go over. So thank you for sticking with me on this. I will put chapters in the video so you can skip around in the video description to the relevant topics if you wish to jump around. But I hope this has been informative and useful, and I hope this helps give some clarity to JSON files, how you set them up, how you use them, and what you can do with them. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask on the Discord. But for now, that will wrap up this video. Thanks for watching.